The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a sound, but the lack of one. It was a Tuesday, and Mark had just settled into the worn groove of his favorite armchair, the one that faced the large picture window looking out into the West Virginia holler. He was about to crack open a new thriller, but his hand paused mid-reach. The house was too quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a solitary evening, but a deep, muffled silence, like the world had been submerged in thick oil. The familiar, frantic chorus of crickets and peepers from the woods was gone. The distant, ever-present groan of a coal, truck shifting gears on the distant ridgeline had vanished. Even the hum of the refrigerator, a sound so constant he'd long since tuned it out, had been snuffed out. It was an absolute, unnerving void. He stood up, his joints complaining softly, and walked to the window. The moon was a sliver, offering little light, and the darkness outside was total, a solid wall of black. He tapped the glass, half expecting it to be soft, to have some give. It didn't. He shrugged, a nervous gesture he'd had since he was a boy. "Storm's coming," he muttered to the empty room, the sound of his own voice, startlingly loud and yet swallowed quickly by the oppressive stillness. He decided a drink was in order. As he poured 2 fingers of bourbon, he noticed the ice in his glass didn't clink. It just settled. That's when the feeling started. A cold prickle at the base of his spine, the ancient, lizard-brain sensation of being watched. He turned slowly, his bourbon forgotten on the counter, and looked back out the window. And he saw it, a light deep in the woods. It bobbed and weaved like a will-o'-the-wisp from his granny's stories. But this was no gentle glow. It was a sickly, phosphorescent green, the color of old bruises and radiation. It pulsed with a slow rhythmic beat like a diseased heart. It wasn't drifting aimlessly. It was moving with a terrible, deliberate purpose, heading straight for his house. Mark's own heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the crushing silence. This wasn't a hunter. Nobody with any sense would be in those woods after dark, not with the ravines and sinkholes that could swallow a man whole. The light broke from the tree line and hovered at the edge of his property, right where the lawn met the wild. It was a perfect sphere, the size of a basketball, floating about 5 feet off the ground. It wasn't attached to anything. It just was. With each pulse, Mark felt a corresponding vibration in his teeth, a low thrum that made the fillings in his molars ache. He backed away from the window, his breath catching in his throat. The green sphere began to drift across the lawn. It didn't illuminate the grass beneath it. It was a hole in the world, a perfect circle of wrongness. He stumbled to his front door, his hands shaking so badly he could barely throw the deadbolt. He leaned against the solid wood, panting, listening. He heard it then. Not a sound, but a pressure change, a presence on the other side of the door. The old oak door, which had stood firm against 100 mountain storms, began to groan. Then a voice. It didn't come through the wood. It bloomed directly inside his mind, slick and cold, like a parasite burrowing into his ear canal. "Mark," it whispered, and the voice was a composite of every childhood fear, every shameful memory, every nightmare he'd ever choked down. "The quiet is so deep here. We have been waiting for a quiet this pure." He clamped his hands over his ears, a useless, instinctive gesture. "Get out of my head!" he screamed, the words thin and reedy, devoured by the silence. "The spaces between your noises are so wide," the voice continued. "Intimate and conversational, so easy to step through. Can you feel them? The beautiful, empty spaces." The front door began to frost over from the inside, a intricate, crystalline lacework spreading from the center outwards. The temperature in the house plummeted. Mark's breath plumed in the suddenly frigid air. He scrambled backwards, through the living room and into the kitchen, his mind racing. He needed a weapon, something real, something solid. His eyes landed on the old cast-iron wood stove, and the heavy poker leaning against it. It was solid, black iron as thick as his thumb. He grabbed it, the weight a comforting, tangible truth in his hand. He turned just as the front door, lock, bolt, and all, shattered inward. It didn't explode. It disintegrated into a cloud of splinters and frost. The green sphere floated into his home. It hung in the center of his living room, its pulsating light casting long, distorted shadows that moved with a life of their own. They crawled up the floral print wallpaper, pooled on the ceiling like oil, and twisted into shapes that defied physics. Spidery, multi-jointed things that scratched at the edges of his vision. "Let us quiet the frantic thing in your skull." "Mark," the voice cooed inside his mind. "Let us give you peace." A tendril of solid darkness peeled away from a shadow on the ceiling and shot toward him, like a spear. Mark swung the iron poker with a grunt. The connection made a sound like tearing metal and shattering glass, a static-filled shriek that vibrated in the air. The shadow tendril dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. The green sphere recoiled, its pulse stuttering, its light flickering to an angry, bloody red for an instant. Iron! It didn't like the iron. A fragment of memory, something his grandfather had muttered about cold iron, keeping the haints away, flashed through his terror-numbed brain. He didn't have time to dwell on it. Another tendril, this one from a shadow on the floor, wrapped around his calf. It was colder than ice, a burning cold that felt like 1,000 needles sinking into his flesh. He roared in pain and fury, bringing the poker down in a brutal arc. The tendril shattered, the cold receding to leave a deep, bone-aching numbness. He was losing. He was just an old man with a fireplace tool against, something from the void between heartbeats. He had to break the silence. His eyes darted around the room, landing on the small, rabbit-eared television on a stand in the corner. The power button glowed with a faint, friendly red. He lunged for it, his body screaming in protest, and slammed his palm against the button. The TV blared to life. A late-night infomercial for a miracle knife set filled the room with a garish, frantic energy. A man with impossibly white teeth was shouting about slicing through a tin can and still cutting a ripe tomato. The effect on the entity was immediate and violent. The green sphere let out a shriek that wasn't a sound, but a physical wave of pain that tore through the air and through Mark's skull. It convulsed, its form blurring and distorting. The living shadows writhed and dissolved into smoke. The voice in his head became a cacophony of furious, agonized screams. The noise. "The filthy, structured noise!" The sphere didn't retreat out the door. It shot across the room and phased directly through the wall behind the television, vanishing. The silence rushed back in, but it was different now. It was the normal empty silence of a ransacked house. The sentient, crushing pressure was gone. Mark stood panting, the poker still clutched in his white-knuckled hand, his body trembling with spent adrenaline. He could hear the ragged saw of his own breath, the wild thumping of his heart. They were the most beautiful sounds he had ever heard. He didn't sleep. He boarded up the shattered doorway with a sheet of plywood, his movement slow and mechanical. He kept every light burning and the television tuned to the loudest, most obnoxious channel he could find. He sat in his chair, the iron poker across his lap, and waited for dawn. When the sun finally rose, the world's noise slowly returned. The birds, a distant dog barking, the faint sound of a neighbor's tractor. It was over. But it wasn't. He went into town that day and bought 3 large, high-powered Bluetooth speakers. He subscribed to every music and talk radio service he could find. He turned his home into a fortress of noise, a constant overlapping barrage of classic rock, political talk, and ambient city sounds. For a week it worked. The woods were just woods again. He was in the kitchen a week later, the speaker on the counter blasting a baseball game. He was making a stew, the sizzle of onions in the pot a comforting domestic sound. Then, the speaker emitted a burst of pure, aggressive static and died. The silence that fell was instant and absolute. The other speakers in the house went dead with it. From the living room, he heard a new sound. A soft, wet, tearing noise, like something heavy and rotten being dragged across his hardwood floor. It had learned. It hadn't been defeated. It had been studying, and it had adapted. This time, it didn't come through the silence. It brought the silence with it. The iron poker was in the living room, leaning against his chair. He was unarmed. The dragging, tearing sound got closer. He backed against the kitchen sink, his eyes fixed on the dark hallway. A shape filled the doorway. It wasn't the sphere. This was what came after the scout. It was tall, stooping to fit under the frame, a thing of jagged, shifting darkness. It had no clear form, but it suggested something insectile and skeletal, with too many limbs all jointed wrong, ending in glistening, sharp points that scratched the floor, creating that wet, tearing sound. Where a face should have been was a swirling vortex of the same sickly green light, and within it, Mark could see the faint, screaming impressions of other faces, the ones it had already made quiet. It took a step into the kitchen, its presence sucking the warmth from the room. The voice returned to his mind, but it was no longer a whisper. It was a deafening roar of static and hate. "The noise is gone. We have consumed it. Now we will consume your silence." It lunged, its jagged limbs reaching for him. Paralyzed, Mark's hand scrabbled blindly on the counter behind him, finding a small, cheap plastic object, the free vegetable chopper that had come with the miracle knife set he'd ordered after that first night. The one from the infomercial. With a guttural scream that was pure defiance, he hurled the flimsy piece of plastic at the creature. It clattered harmlessly against the creature's chest and fell to the linoleum. The creature stopped. The roaring static in Mark's mind ceased. The vortex of green light that was its face seemed to focus on the small, colorful object on the floor. It tilted its head, a gesture of pure, uncomprehending confusion. The sheer, profound absurdity of it. The ultimate contrast between this cosmic horror and a cheap piece of consumer junk was a cognitive virus the entity could not process. It was a form of chaos it had no defense against. The creature emitted a sound that was equal parts shriek and frustrated groan. Its form flickered, destabilized. The green light swirled violently, the screaming faces within becoming more distinct, more frantic. The jagged limbs retracted, and the whole monstrous form collapsed in on itself with a final, wet pop, vanishing from existence. The hum of the refrigerator returned. The baseball game from the speaker resumed as if it had never stopped. Mark slid down the cabinets onto the floor, shaking uncontrollably. He stared at the stupid vegetable chopper. He started to laugh, a high, broken sound that was closer to a sob. He had faced the void, and he had defeated it not with cold iron, but with the sheer ridiculous noise of being human. He never let his house be quiet again. The noise was his shield, his weapon, his prayer. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the silence wasn't empty. It was a door. And something was always on the other side, listening.